All right, welcome everybody to the 2020 Zelen Symposium. The goal of this yearly event, we have had it a few years running now, is to make applied statistics broadly available to the Boston community. Although recently the event has grown in popularity and we have had visitors from beyond Boston. This year in particular, we have had registrations from all over the globe because the event is online, as you can see. The event is named after Marvin Zelen. He's the founder of our department and an important figure in bringing applied statistics and data science to prominence. He was a data scientist back in 1970s, brought the first computer to Dana-Farber. This year's theme is data science in 2020, and we have put together a great set of speakers with expertise in how data is used in 2020 related topics: elections, misinformation, climate, US Census, and the Olympics, which have been moved to 2021, but that's okay, we're still very interested. And of course, the reason for that move is COVID-19 pandemic, which is why we had the original date that we had for this event. We used it for a symposium on that topic. So this year, Dana-Farber is partnering with the Brown Institute and Columbia University to organize this event. The idea for these themes came from Mark Hansen, one of our organizers and one of the directors of the Brown Institute, which we want to thank profusely for all the help for having the idea and also getting some of the speakers to come and talk. We'll also thank Paul, Catalano, and Erica, who were part of the organizing committee, and a special thanks to Erica, who did a lot of work to make this all work. It was quite a challenge, this new venue. We also want to thank the speakers for their flexibility and willingness to participate remotely. And finally, we want to thank the Zelen family for their support and for making this event possible. So some logistics before we get going. The talks are going to be 50 minutes. We won't interrupt for questions. We'll have the questions at the end. We'll have 5 minutes for questions. I'm expecting a lot of them. Make sure to enter your questions on the chat if you can, and I'll read them to keep it just so we don't have the muting problem. So we want everybody to keep muted through the speaking part of the program. We will have sessions like we're going to try to imitate what would be a coffee break, and there everybody can unmute if they want. So in those sessions, open sessions, we'll have 7 breakout rooms, one speaker room where the speakers will be chatting there, and then we'll have 6 general rooms, and people can feel free to mingle with other attendees in any of those rooms. I don't know how that's going to work out, but we'll see. In these times, you feel free to connect with the speakers and ask them further questions if you didn't have time to ask, or we didn't get to your question. All right. So with that said, we're going to get started. Our first speaker is going to talk about a very important topic for these days, the 2020 census. Everybody that hasn't filled it out, go fill it out. The title of the talk is the 2020 Census, Expected versus Actual. The speaker is Amy O'Hara, who is a research professor in the Massive Data Institute and executive director of the Federal Statistical Research Data Center at the McCourt School of Public Health Policy. She also leads the Administrative Data Research Initiative, improving secure, responsible data access for research and evaluation. Dr. O'Hara addresses risks involved with data sharing by connecting practices across the social, health, computer, and data science. And I'm going to stop there because my internet is a little slow, and let Amy take it away.
Thank you. Great. I'm so glad to be here and to be talking about the 2020 census. And I'd like to reiterate, if you haven't filled it out, please do. We don't want people knocking on doors unless they absolutely have to. And the door knocking is going to be ending in just a few days. So I want to run across a couple of the census basics. And if you're not familiar with it, it is required by the Constitution. And the fundamental role of the census is to come up with the apportionment numbers that determines the number of representatives each state will have in the House of Representatives. The census has been conducted every 10 years since 1790. And in the US, we measure where people live and sleep on census day, not where they happen to be on census day, but where they usually live and sleep. Census Day is April 1 and has been that way for several decades in a row. Back through history, it was on January 1st or in June or in August, but it's been April 1 for many years now. The 2020 census expects about 330 million residents of the US, and the results are typically due to the president by December 31st. But if you've been watching the news, there are several court cases dealing with the truncation of fieldwork, which would have them end fieldwork earlier than the Census Bureau wanted to, and the census had requested an extension of the deadline to next April, since the pandemic has had such a negative effect on operations. So what I'm going to be talking about are the expectations, what's happened this year, the consequences, and then a bit about the impacts. This was to be a traditional address-based census. And I say traditional to compare that to a registered-based census like they do in the Nordic countries, where they have much better dwelling registers, population registers that they can pull the information from. For instance, some of the Nordic countries haven't done a traditional census since 1960. This year, the Census Bureau was to innovate in three major ways. One, it's the first time that the whole census was going to be conducted online. There were some tests done in 2010, but this is the first time that there was an online instrument to try to collect the data. The second big innovation is an expanded use of administrative data from other government agencies. There have always been administrative data used for populations in nursing homes or correctional facilities or college dorms. Those are administrative data sources, but this time, much broader use of administrative data was planned. Another major change for this census was the way that the privacy of respondents was to be protected, and I'll get into this more in a minute. So just going back to administrative data, this is information that was collected not for statistical purposes. So it could be data from commercial vendors, it could be data from the IRS, from the Social Security Administration, and it has quite good coverage for some parts of the population, but very weak coverage in other parts of the population. The map to the right here is a study that we did back in 2010, comparing the 2010 census to administrative data from IRS, from HUD, from Medicare, from a combination of some federal sources. And purple is good. Purple means that we saw the same people in administrative data. This, of course, relies on the strength of our record linkage approach, our ability to match people between the census data and the government data. But they were intended to use more of this information for the 2020 census. Now, back in 2010, the Bureau released tables that had over 7 billion numbers in them. Okay, that was about more than 20 different data elements for every single person. And that was leaking privacy. So the Census Bureau, once they realized that database reconstruction attacks were possible on this data, so even if it was just a table of data, through different computational means, you would be able to reconstruct the different compositions of people that live on your block. Now that conflicts with what I've highlighted here on the left, which is that the Census Bureau must make sure that they are protecting the privacy of the individuals. This is the confidentiality clause that's in the Census Act. And so they decided that they would apply much stronger privacy preservation to the data for 2020 than they had in any years past, which had generally relied on some swapping and some rounding that ended up protecting people. So what happened this time? There were some court cases involving Citizenship Question. There was an executive order still trying to collect citizenship data. We have this pandemic. And then finally, there's a presidential memo. So you can see that 3 of these 4 are political influences on the census that really hadn't happened in years past. So unpacking them a bit, the Trump administration tried to get a citizenship question on the form. Census was planning to do that. There were a number of lawsuits that contested it. It ended up going to the Supreme Court, and they said that the question could not be asked, not because it would be improper to ask the question, but because the argument had not been strong enough for the purpose for which they were doing it. So the census had already gotten too close to its operational schedule so that they could not add a question to the form. Instead, the Trump administration released an executive order directing the Census Bureau to get data from a number of administrative data sources. And those are reflected in these blocks to the right. So this would be passport data from the Department of State, information on arrivals and departures from Customs and Border Control in Homeland Security, the list of all Social Security numbers issued from SSA, information on people in federal detainment from BOP, Bureau of Prisons, or the Marshals Service. All of this administrative data was then a rush order to get it to the Census Bureau so they could try to count citizens. Bear in mind, all of this is happening while they are supposed to be counting all residents of the United States. That's what the decennial census is supposed to do, but the executive order said, draw in this data and figure out how you would be able to get a count of citizens so that we could look at citizen voting age population. So as they're doing that, a presidential memo comes out instructing the Census Bureau to count undocumented individuals so that they could be removed from the apportionment counts. Now, all of this is happening during the census timeline, which operations actually begin back in 2019. And in the spring of 2020, they start mailing you things. You got them. But now this is when the pandemic is starting. And during April 1 Census Day, census operations, we have all of this displacement due to the pandemic, where college students were sent home, where people wanted to leave hotspots, and that disrupted what the data collection was, regardless of where you usually live and sleep. So the summer and fall have had the Bureau trying to get back on track, but they had delayed field work. They couldn't be out collecting data door to door when people failed to respond online, when they failed to fill out forms. They had to go out and knock on doors. But with the pandemic, they ended up with over 150,000 fewer door knockers than they wanted and great delays to the field work. So this means that they have all of these different impacts of the pandemic and the political influence of needing to come up with these citizenship numbers. And they are scrambling to get results together that could be due December 31st, or they could get that extension till next April. All of this is happening amongst this illness, the decreasing trust in government, fear of deportation from your information being used, as well as fear from getting sick from some stranger knocking on your door. Finally, there were some administrative data impacts, because if you recall, the IRS gave everybody a filing deadline extension. So that means that all of the planning that had been done with when the Census Bureau expected to get administrative data has now been shifted because of the pandemic. And they are, as I mentioned a moment ago, scrambling to get all of this information put together to make it a full enumeration of all US residents. So the consequences of this, there's a lot of uncertainty, and it's uncertainty over the three primary uses of decennial census data, which are apportionment, redistricting, and the distribution of federal funding. So the apportionment numbers have to be state counts for everybody, and the count is underway. They are trying to get to 99% of housing units finished in every single area of the country. The Secretary of Commerce said that the field work should be done by October 5. It's unclear whether that is going to result in a full and accurate enumeration. The Census Bureau is likely to have to do quite a bit of fill-in for missing data with statistical methods. Now, they also have to comply with the presidential memo, which I've quoted here, because the administration has asked that the Census Bureau produce numbers so that they could exclude from the apportionment base aliens who are not in a lawful immigration status. So they are trying to get that information together to comply with this presidential memo. This too is being challenged in court by a number of different lawsuits and is likely on its way to the Supreme Court. So the data are also used in redistricting. And I just wanted to show you some work that the State Demography Office in Colorado had done where they're looking at the impact that that privacy preservation could have on their population. So of course, you're going to use the census population numbers to redraw your districts. But when you think about differential privacy, it is a mathematical way to add a little bit of noise so that you're protecting the privacy of those individuals in the data. And if you were to do that just with straightforward math, you would turn some areas positive and some areas negative. You might end up with fractional people. That's not okay for the census. So you have this bias where they've had to go in and correct so that you don't have negative populations in any areas. You also don't want areas that are all children or all adults. You need to make sure that the privacy protection being applied is going to be adequate for its purpose, but also generate data that have utility and believability. So whenever Colorado is looking at their counties, you can see that you have some winners and you have some losers. And that is exclusively due to the privacy preservation approach. So this was a study done on the data before we even got into the uncertainty of the accuracy of the counts because of the pandemic. So this is something that I will come back to, the impact that this differential privacy preservation approach may have into the future. So the impact on funding. The census is really important. We all know that. But when you look at the numbers, it's pretty eye-popping. The census data moved $1.5 trillion to state and local governments, nonprofits, and businesses. And that's nearly 8% of GDP. This is from some incredible detailed work done by Andrew Reamer at GW. And he also details, and this is his graph, on a figure on the right, how the census data filter into all of these different aspects that affect the data that you use, whether it's survey data, whether it is urban rural classifications, whether you're looking at the poverty thresholds, whenever you're pulling that through to your analyses. The census data, it infiltrates all of these different data sources. So if there's any uncertainty about its accuracy, you have to wonder how it's affecting these different downstream products that are derived using census data. So finally, the impact, and I think about it as a data user myself, the impact on pop estimates, the impact on trends that you look at, the use by government officials, whether at the federal or the state or the local level, and the use by everybody else, including us. So when I said before how the data could be precedent setting, this is pulling back to that privacy preservation because it's critically important. You want to be able to produce all of this data and you want it to be as accurate as possible, but you understand that the Census Bureau does not want to release any data that could be used to re-identify any individuals, especially if the information on that individual's citizenship status is going to be included. So I just included a couple of snapshots here of work that's looking at the impact of different privacy preservation approaches that the Census Bureau is considering. And on the left, you can see that it may have a differential impact on Native Americans. And on the right, you can see it may have a differential impact for Hispanic. I know it's a little fuzzy on the right there, but the pinkish dots are for Hispanic and the teal colored dots are for non-Hispanic. And you can see that the privacy preserving approach at different levels has this greater impact on Hispanic than non-Hispanic populations in these counties in Minnesota until you get up to this lower right where it has less privacy protection, but more accuracy. So is there a precedent being set with this trade-off between privacy and accuracy? But how do we know what effect that's going to have on the data downstream for all of us users? So here's a question. Should we have a do-over or should we just do better in the future? It is possible that there could be a mid-decade census. It's actually a law on the book saying that the Census Bureau could do a mid-decade census. but they are incredibly expensive. So this census costs somewhere in the neighborhood of $16 billion. The question is, whatever Congress we have in a couple of years, are they going to put that kind of money back up to do a mid-decade census? Should we wait until 2030? And there's an interesting story, there's an interesting story about the 1920 census. The 1920 census was conducted but not used for apportionment because its quality was questioned. So what about this 2020 census? How will we know if it's fit for use? How will we know if it's good enough to use on its own? Or should we take what data are there that are collected that are fit for use and take the remaining and blend it with other sources like administrative data, like data from the private sector potentially, in order to figure out how to come up with the best information to plan and govern and manage our society? So as we look to do better in the future, could there be a move away from an address-based census to a person-based census, where maybe you'd be able to use someone's cell data more easily than you would now, which we tie everything back to an address? Other countries that have moved away from a traditional census toward a register-based census have single-payer insurance systems. That means that you generally start with something that is built into their register. The UK is looking into this for their next census cycles. If there were one in the United States, would that be a way to move away from this door knocking data collection model that we have? Will there be a different immigration system that makes it easier to count all residents? Or will there be different laws that stipulate that we only count citizens, which is also a possibility given a number of suits that are in the courts right now? Would a different or a differently accessible vital record system make a difference here in order to understand where there are births? Countries that have population registers build that from their vital record systems. They have an understanding of where people are and where they live and where they move. How important will private sector data be as we move ahead? As I mentioned before, there's a lot of use of data from Housing and Urban Development or Internal Revenue Service or Social Security Administration, but relatively little from the private sector. And we know that we're all highly dependent on a lot of our devices now. Is there a way to leverage that information to make more accurate population measures and understand where people typically live and sleep? And the question there is, right now, there are lots of sensors on things. People are walking around carrying sensors, wearing sensors. Will there be sensors in people? And what would that mean? How would you use this data? So at Georgetown, I work on the ethical and governance aspects of this. And if you have questions, I would be glad to answer them, and also really interested in hearing the rest of the speakers and how we can kind of dig ourselves out from 2020. Thank you.
Thank you. Am I here? Yeah, so we have just a minute for questions, but I want to ask you a couple real quick. How does the American Community Survey tie into all this? That's something that's done every year, no? But it's based on census data, it just adjusts somehow? Why not just use that for the next 10 years?
So you can use the ACS. It is a sample of about 2 million households every year, which gets you 3.5 to 4 million person responses, but it is weighted using the decennial census. So if the decennial census numbers get wagged around through privacy preservation, it would have a downstream impact into the ACS. The responses alone would remain valid because it's based off an address frame from the US Postal Service, but it would be the way that you make that representative to the population that may be suspect.
Interesting. So another question, this is maybe not as big of a population, but how are homeless or people without homes counted?
Yeah, the Census Bureau has community partners and has a special point in time where they collect that information and then fold it into the decennial counts. There are a number of rules that they use for how they code those individuals to blocks, because with any census response, It's coded to the block group, the tract, the county, and then rolling up to the state. And so they have a process by which they do that for people that are not in a shelter situation. It's part of the group quarters data.
Okay, well, thanks. So I have a lot of other questions, but we're gonna move on. Maybe we'll ask them at the break.